Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Europa Rediviva. I've heard a few people lately worrying about the prospects that artificial intelligence might take their jobs. And they did not frame it in the sense that it would allow them to pursue other occupations, but rather that it would deprive them of their livelihoods. So people who actually have a quite strong instilled fear that the advent of AI will just make them unemployable and subsequently will just deprive them of any opportunity to make an income. And eventually that this might threaten their their lives in the sense that they might end up on the streets or something. And I'd like to discuss a bit about this topic because there are several nuances to it. First of all, there are two ways in which you can approach an economy, the economy of a country. You can look at it, as I look at it, for example, as a means to satisfy needs of the people, of the citizens living in that country. Needs which are guaranteed to be satisfied through the social contract, through the constitution. So they have, the government takes it upon itself to provide the citizens with healthcare, education, food, shelter, basically all the basic needs. And then there is this extra economy, so to say, so the economy that exceeds the satisfaction of the basic necessities, which produces additional income, but which does not threaten the survivability of the population, so to say. And there is another angle to looking at an economy, maximization of the return on capital. This is the corporate way, or the, let's say, the neoliberal way, the way in which people are taught to look at an economy in the collective West, in economics faculties of the capitalist West. And people who have this kind of education or who live in countries that abide by this philosophy have a tendency to perceive themselves as basically indentured servants on the labor market, even though they might make a good salary. So there's the perception in these hyper-capitalist countries and among the people who have studied this approach in their economics training, that you only derive income through work, and if you have no more value on the labor market, then the fentanyl streets await you. So there is no social protection system. For example, in the United States, there are many people who are out on the streets not for a fault of their own. They had bad luck, or they encountered some sort of problems. Their house burned down. I don't know. They had to care for somebody who was sick, and subsequently they could not afford to pay the medical bills, and they went bankrupt. All sorts of things. And the United States is indeed a society where if you have no more value on the labor market, or even if for a short period of time, then yeah, you run the risk of becoming some sort of human waste, in the sense that society discards you. You are out on the street, and your only chance, you have no chance of climbing back up, because there's no social elevator. There's no way in which you can get a job while living on the street, and so on. So your only occupation from that point onward is shooting fentanyl and waiting to die, essentially. But most societies, I would say, are not based on the American model. So most societies are not based on this consideration of their citizens as simple inputs for corporations. And they regard their citizens as end points, not as means to an end. And therefore, these societies function to a large extent to the benefit of their citizens. And therefore, there is no question that AI could threaten their livelihoods. So even if AI replaces a lot of the jobs, that still leaves the state with the obligation to provide for its citizens. And it's logical that the state would tax the economic activity that results even without human labor, and that it would offer a welfare. It would continue to provide sustenance for the majority of its citizens, those that are no longer able to work. So in this AI future where Western economies that are so much dependent on the service sector might get automatized, the only direction in which things could go, in most of them, is the direction of some sort of socialism. And you can do socialism in whichever conditions. It doesn't matter how rich or how poor the economy is. You can always do socialism. It's not exactly obvious that you can always do capitalism, irrespective of how the local conditions are. But socialism for sure you can do, because socialism just starts from what exists in that country, from the resources that it has, and from the labor of the people, and it tries to allocate it as such as to satisfy the needs, the basic necessities of that population. A completely different approach than to see your population as a kind of chattel, as a kind of livestock that you just rent it out to foreign corporations. I agree that there are countries that see their populations like this. So the United States is the number one example because even though it is an empire, I would argue that it is not a sovereign country, and not because it is beholden to Israel or such things, but it is not beholden to its own population. So even though the United States bullies everybody into giving up their resources and into supporting the US dollar and so on abroad, and even though this manages to keep a high level of income for the majority of the working people in the United States, however, because the United States is beholden to the American capital, so to the American corporations and to the owners of these corporations and banks and so on, then the US economy is structured in a way so as to milk their own population as much as possible. Maybe not so much through taxation, but through the services that the state should offer and does not, and that are outsourced to private corporations. So healthcare, even healthcare insurance, and the healthcare insurance industry makes a profit out of denying coverage. Whenever you get sick, even if you have insurance, you have to fight with your insurer to actually give you the money for whatever procedure you have, and they have the incentive to just deny you coverage and to accept the possibility of incurring some legal fees further on. It is their dominant strategy to just deny you coverage outright, and in case you might have the resources to sue them, then they are basically estimating their chances of victory to be high enough so that it's worth it. But anyway, it's this corporate system that extracts rents in the sense of in the sense that they are private monopolies, even though it's an industry with an atomized structure, even though there are many players in that industry. It still extracts rents because it is offering something that is essential for human survival, and therefore they are people are basically obliged to purchase those services or to try to purchase those services because their lives depend on them, and they can afford to keep healthcare costs very high. The United States is the number one country in the world in terms of healthcare costs. So yeah, the healthcare industry extracts these monopoly rents, quasi-monopoly rents. And it's the same with the educational system. Higher education costs a lot in the United States. universities are also. I'm not sure if they are for-profit corporations. I think they are foundations, but they still function with a profit motive. They function in the logic of profit maximization as well. And there are many aspects of of American society that should be provided by the state and that are provided by the state in many developed countries. But because the paradigm is to milk the population as much as possible, there is private industry that makes rents out of these industries and out of providing these services. And therefore, since the paradigm of the United States regarding its own citizens is to see them as livestock that needs to be exploited for the benefit of the capital owners, then it is to be expected that just as there was a social disaster regarding outsourcing of industry to Asia in the 1990s, there's going to be a social disaster regarding automation, regarding the employment of AI in the service sector and maybe even in manufacturing. So those people that will be laid off massively will not get much support from the state, because the state does not see itself as catering to them. It caters to the corporations, and it is also pursuing this imperialist strategy abroad, also to the benefit of corporations and to the capital owners. It is not doing this in order to expand the livelihoods of the ordinary Americans, to make them richer and so on, but it is just to obtain new investment opportunities for American corporations, to be able to sell weapons, so to cater to the military industrial complex and so on. So the excess people that are needed for the US economy will be just funneled to the prison system, which is also in many states a private prison system where they are exploited as slave labor, or just out on the streets to make them captive consumers to the drug industry and to have them, commit crime in order to obtain their drugs and so on. The US government doesn't really care about what happens to the majority of its people. It just caters to the elites that keep the system running. And this happens as a consequence of the fact that the American public is brainwashed into voting for the same two parties. The US doesn't have a two-party system. Saying that the US has a two-party system would be like saying that would be akin to China having a one-party system, but it's not like this. The United States has more than two political parties which are legally registered and which run in elections every 4 years or 2 years when they have the midterms. But the people are brainwashed into only voting for these two because they take their information and their worldview from mainstream media, from Hollywood. They cannot afford higher education. Even that higher education is not of adequate quality so as to instill in them some critical thinking. And so the majority of the American public is just captured by this duopoly of the Republican and the Democratic Party, which do not differ in policies. Maybe they differ in some in some cultural policies, but not in the socio-economic policies. They regard their population in the same way, or they disregard their population in the same way. And therefore, the US population doesn't seem to derive much benefit from the advent of AI. I would think rather the contrary. So I would expect to have the Philadelphia streets or Skid Row or all of these inner city hellholes filled with drug addicts and with just garbage, to have them expand massively inside the American cities, to just to have rich people live in gated communities and just Mad Max for the rest of society. And I also expect this to be the prospect for countries that are captured by the United States politically, militarily, So countries that cannot afford socialism, that cannot afford social measures, welfare measures for their citizens, because either the United States occupies them militarily, or the United States finances a junta that occupies them militarily and that runs the country to the benefit of American corporations. Here I think of the banana republics in Latin America, the so-called banana republics. They were called like this because they were plantations for Chiquita, the American, well, it was called United Fruit back then. And yeah, they were basically owned by the United States and operated by the United States as slave labor for United Fruit. And some of the Latin American countries still function in this paradigm to this day. So they either do not have elections, or if they have elections, it's a heavily rigged system in which only US puppets win. And their population has no social rights, has no way of deriving these rights from the state: the right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to decent livelihood, and all of these things. And so, yeah, such countries might be threatened also by the advent of AI, because they do not function to the benefit of their own populations. Their population is just rented out to American corporations and has no political power to derive a different path for themselves. Once the American corporations render them obsolete, once they are made redundant, yeah, their populations could be used in other ways. I don't want to get into it, but if you read the Epstein files, you'll know what I mean. And or if you look at all this this dystopian propaganda that they pushed out with the Hunger Games, and also the World Economic Forum books regarding this technological dystopia, transhumanism, and you'll own nothing and be happy. So American corporations might devise such plans for their captive populations to do, I don't know, to use them for entertainment or for pedophilia or for these kinds of things. But there's also a third category of countries that are neither the empire nor militarily occupied by the empire, but they're somehow brainwashed into not following their own interests, and the population is not politically aware, and it doesn't understand what it is voting for and what it should want from how the country is run. And here I can think of some examples in Europe. Like Germany could be one example. Even though Germany has quite an extensive welfare state, it is actively demolishing it, both directly and indirectly, through reallocation of funds to other goals that are deemed worthwhile by the state, but they do not cater to the welfare of the citizens. I can think of some politically captured countries in Eastern Europe, such as Romania, where also people do not perceive the economy as being their own. They do not believe that the economic system should work in their favor. They just believe that they should win the race to becoming a higher paid employee to the economic structure that is owned by Western corporations. So the Romanian economy is basically made up of outsourcing done by Western multinational corporations. And a lot of it is business process outsourcing. So service sector that is liable to be automatized with AI, and therefore for the Romanian labor force employed in this sector to be rendered redundant. But the majority of the population employed in these white-collar jobs do not regard themselves as having some sort of inalienable right to sustenance, to just making a livelihood because they exist, you know. These rights, these positive rights, were enshrined in constitutions. As a consequence, of the fact that modernity came along with the idea that all citizens are equal, all human beings are equal, and they all have the right to live and to, well, the Americans wrote in their constitution, the pursuit of happiness. Anyway, the right to livelihood, so the right to education, to all the things that make up the good life, or at least the basics of what it is required to be able to survive and to thrive. And countries that do not regard the economy as having to cater for that are liable to suffer a lot under this paradigm, because even if they were deemed necessary in the outsourcing age, now the age of globalization is ending, and economies have to first and foremost cater for their own citizens and to be devised so as to fulfill the needs of the local population, of the citizens who have rights to derive from that economy. There are examples, quite a lot actually, of agricultural countries in Africa and Latin America that are food deficient, in the sense that even though they are agricultural exporters, they do not feed their population. They are unable to feed their population. And this happens because, as a consequence of the Washington Consensus policies from the 1990s, and even before that, countries were made to abandon their agricultural sector for domestic use. So to abandon small-scale sustenance farming and to shift to cash crops, to shift to export-driven production of different things that can be sold on international markets. And this is how you got African countries who did not have enough food produced domestically to feed their population start cultivating coffee, or start cultivating rapeseed, or these kinds of cash crops that are needed by the Western public, and of course whose prices fluctuate wildly, and that can easily bankrupt the farmers because of overproduction in several countries, and that cannot be eaten, that cannot be consumed by the local population. So you could have mass starvation in a country where the main economic activity is agriculture. It is possible, and it has happened. It's kind of the same if you look at the wider economic system. A country should have, for example, an energy sector that should cater to first and foremost to the consumption of the population itself, and then the energy consumption of the industries that basically uphold the basic needs of the population, and the rest, of course, can be sold abroad and everything. But if you have if you have an energy sector that just sells everything abroad, and then you have to buy it at international prices, you have to buy the energy you need at international prices. Of course, that's not a system devised for the needs of the local population. The food sector, I already explained how it should at least provide sustenance for the domestic population. Pharmaceuticals. There are many things that need to be produced domestically, so as when you have logistic bottlenecks, supply shocks, such as, for example, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz or the corona lockdowns and so on, that you are not dependent from outside sources from where you can no longer source. It's important to have them produced domestically, and so on. So it is important for such countries to abandon the paradigm of the so-called free market capitalism, invisible hand which allocates resources and so on, and to regard themselves first and foremost as citizens that have rights enshrined in the Constitution, which translate into obligations from the government to provide those things, and then to vote accordingly for parties that want to provide those things and that want to shake up the economic model that is just based on outsourcing, and that make the Romanian economy an annex, a manufacturing and service outsourcing annex of Western capital, of the Western corporations, instead of having the local economy as a means to provide for the needs of the local population. So some sort of active citizenry would be required in order to cross that gap from the current economic model to what AI could bring in terms of threats and opportunities. So these are kind of the three categories of countries that I wanted to point out that they would be affected by the AI shock. For the rest, for the countries that first and foremost provide to the welfare of their citizens, I would expect that a lot of new employment will be created in all sorts of areas which are now not monetized, just because so much of the economic activity sustaining basic needs will be automatized and therefore will be at reduced cost, and therefore a lot of resources that are in that economy will be freed up in order to pursue other activities which are socially worthwhile, but are not monetizable in the current capitalist-driven economic system. I can think of one quick example. Under socialism in Romania, and I'm sure this was the case in all socialist countries, at least in Europe, the Writers Guild, so the Union of Writers, had a network of, they call them creation houses. So there were villas in the mountains and on the seashore where writers, poets, people who were registered with the Writers Guild could just go for extended periods in order to write literature. It's a far cry from what capitalism offers, right? If you want to become a writer in the capitalist West, the most you can hope for is to have a residency, to receive a residency from a corporation, to pay you to stay for 2 weeks or 1 month in one place. But then your writings have to cater to the vision and the needs of the corporate oligarchy, and that prohibits you from pursuing any kind of social goals in your work. And yeah, for example, this is something that can be done with the freed up resources, and I can think of many other things in order to support people who actually care for the public good and who deliver things for free, and to be able to offer them sustenance without forcing them to take up menial, soul-destroying corporate jobs. So this is what I wanted to tell you today about the advent of AI. If you like what I do, like, share, subscribe. If you want to support me financially, you'll find the link in the channel description. And until next time, take care.